G'day folks, it's Nick Monk here again with another critique. This one's been sent in by Florian Perret, or Perret. I'm sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, Florian. And I'm very pleased he has sent this in. I don't know Florian personally, and this is the first time I've actually come across his work. But I'm very, very pleased that he's sent it to me because there's a bit to talk about in this image. And none of it's to detract from Florian's work. I hope Florian gets a fair bit out of this, and I also hope that that others that are watching this video, particularly that are starting out in landscape photography, also get a lot of benefit, because there's a few things here that I think could be improved on, and some general ideas that I have about landscape photography in general I'm going to incorporate into this critique. So it's a bit of a trigger for some things that I'd like to say about particularly those that are starting out in landscape photography. Okay, Florian's sent me some information with this tutorial, with this photograph. This is a photograph of Lion Rock, which is a very famous rock feature located in Southwest National Park, Tasmania. To get to this location is probably 2.5 hours walk from the southernmost point in Tasmania that you can drive, being from Cockle Creek. And it's a very popular spot for bushwalkers. It's the start or the end of the South Coast Track. And it's also a very popular spot for surfers with a nearby campground and a really good spot to visit. Florian's taken this photograph using a Nikon D800. He didn't specify exactly what lens to me, but it was taken at 24mm in focal length. He's also told me that he's used 5 different images of the same scene, taken at the same time, but 5 different exposures to create this image. Most of those exposures, I believe, have been used to capture the brightness in the scene, and he's also stated that he has focus stacked the foreground to get that nicely in focus. And those things are things I'm going to talk about. But first I'll talk about the composition, because Florian's main motivation for sending this particular image to me is the composition. He's not sure that it works, and he acknowledges that he probably could have done some other things to it, but I think he just wishes to have my opinion on it. This isn't an unpleasant photograph at all. It's a very nice scene, and like I said, quite a famous one in Tasmania. And it's taken above the beach. He's had to climb up onto some rocks above the waterline, which is a pretty sensible thing because at times the waves can really crash in down at the base. But he's also taken it to get a particular perspective and viewpoint on the rock, as well as the foreground. I guess the first thing that strikes me about this is most of the interest in the photograph is, I guess, more to the right of the image, probably from the centre across to the right. So we have the rock here, which is obviously the main focus of the photograph. And we have this foreground set of rocks here. But on the left-hand side, there's not a lot of general interest to draw the eye. It's fairly open with not much here. We do have a rising sun over here that hasn't quite popped through. And your eye does get drawn to this area after you've had a look at the rock. But generally, there's not a lot happening in this area for us to have our eye flow through it. So, I guess to make it a more successful composition based on what we actually have, we could crop the image, which I think would work quite well. Just select the crop tool, and I would pretty much cut out the left-hand side of the image and almost make it maybe square or even a vertical composition. So if we look at it like that, we really now do get some impact from this foreground and a very nice leading through to Lion Rock. I think that probably is the better composition based on this image. If it was square, that would still work. It's not quite as balanced. There's still not quite as much happening over here. So I would suggest something like that. And this is from a Nikon D810, so it's a very high megapixel camera, and you could easily print a very large shot still, even with this sort of crop. Something to consider anyway, but certainly with this crop it's very strong in composition and works quite well. What else I would do when framing this image if I was on location, I would very much twist in this direction so the rock became more at the centre of the rear, and I would probably try and lower my viewpoint a bit. You couldn't lower too far, because what we don't want is we don't want this part of the rock suddenly clashing in with Lion Rock here. We need that separation still between the two elements. But I'd probably just lower my viewpoint or step back a bit. Now I know it's on the edge of a bit of a bank or a cliff sort of face here. I don't know how far you can step back, but probably not that far. And just lower myself down and make a bit more prominence of this foreground rock, which would probably help. Or I would turn my camera vertical and I would shoot more of that vertical composition that we saw before, maybe with a little bit more of this rock revealed, to just really strengthen that. And that I'd probably, if that was the case, I'd probably not need to lower my viewpoint too much. The other thing is the top of Lion Rock here is quite close to the top of the frame. And whatever composition I chose, I'd probably choose one that just left a little bit more room at the top, just give it a bit more of a chance to breathe. And if I was doing a vertical composition, I'd probably also just get a bit more on this side, just to give it a bit of room to breathe. What I do like is Florian's use of a fairly fast shutter speed to capture the waves more frozen. I mean, they're not completely frozen. It's still a relatively long shutter speed, but it's not seconds. It's maybe a quarter of a second or a tenth of a second or something like that. So we really get to see the frozen movement of the textures here, rather than the general 10 to have a longer exposure and create those misty effects in here. Now that's a matter of taste. I think with this particular scene it works quite well. The textures in there, and they really do add some interest to the scene, which is really lovely. What I probably want to talk about now is just this viewpoint in general, given the time of day. We have the rising sun over here, and we're shooting, Florian's shooting basically into the sun. So if you were just shooting a single image of this, I'd expect if you were going to keep this part at this brightness, then we would have quite a black rock here with next to no detail, and probably quite black foreground as well. Now he's used some image blending to make sure that those tones aren't in deep shadow, but I'm not sure that that has been overly successful. I think that the real viewpoint for shooting Lion Rock at sunrise is probably over on the other side of Lion Rock. And what that's achieving is when you're shooting from over here and you're shooting towards the face of Lion Rock, you're getting the natural light that's present in the scene to do the work for you. You've got the rising sun, you've got light coming in. We can see there's some sunlight that's just starting to come over the top here, and within a minute or two I imagine there would have been some nice light on this rock, and probably nice light right at this point from over here. That helps with some of the issues that you get from shooting into the sun. By not shooting into the sun, you let the natural light work for you, and there's less of a need to exposure blend. Now, I don't exposure blend. I never have. I use graduated filters. But if this was me shooting this scene, I doubt I would be shooting this viewpoint at all at this time of day. This is more the viewpoint I'd consider at sunset, when we've got the light coming onto this face of Lion Rock. It seems to be a real trend these days to shoot towards the sun, and I'm not quite sure why that is, because it generally complicates everything. It makes it difficult to capture detail in the shadows and forces you to use blending, or to push the dynamic range of your camera by enhancing the shadows. It's possible to do, of course, and there's some very successful examples of it. But Florian tells me he's been shooting since about February 2016, and I'm just not sure that this is the best thing to do for someone that's just generally starting to get the feel for landscape photography. It complicates things. And I think as a general advice for anyone that's starting in landscape photography is don't overcomplicate things. Let the natural light in the scene work for you. Look for the viewpoint that's going to allow you to capture the light as it falls. Look to where the light is falling. Don't look to where it's coming from necessarily. Learn to work with the light that's falling on the scene away from the sun first, and then later you can concentrate on trying to capture scenes like this with exposure blending. Now, I provide that advice as a general thing, but I've also provided it with the evidence-based in this particular scene, which I just want to talk about and just explain to Florian why I think this might have been a little complicated in terms of exposure blending. It doesn't feel all that natural, the image in general. We do have fairly dark shadows. There is some detail there, but some fairly dark tones over here, which are in obvious shadow. And over here we have quite, in comparison, significantly lighter tones. Now, that's not to say there's anything wrong with lightening this part and leaving this as it is, because it isn't generally. But what it does feel is it does give it a bit of an unnatural feel to the image, a bit of a high dynamic range or an HDR look to it that just seems a little unnatural. And probably, with these rocks in this area here as well, it just doesn't seem to have that real natural sort of tone to it. Now that's a matter of opinion, of course. I'm not expecting everyone to have my taste in photography, but I do want to point out some things where some mistakes that Florian's made in exposure blending that's given a few problems to the image, particularly if you wanted to print it. Now I've zoomed in here to show you an example of what I mean, and we have a very clear unintentional mark here that you can see quite clearly from the full screen shot, but when we zoom in you can see that there's a very bright section of this shadow bit which is completely different to here. Now it's not related to this bit where the sun has come through at all. What it's related to is the editing that Florian's done in blending the images together by using masks or whichever method he's chosen. He's actually overrun the edge here, which is, it's brightened the rock here, but also brightened unintentionally this spot here, and it's quite obvious. And if we look up further here, you can see a bit of a halo around the edges. I've just moved to another section, and again looking at the edge of the rock here, we do have a bit of a halo. It's not particularly dramatic as before, but you can still see the outline throughout this rock, and it does detract a little from the image. Now, there's some other things here that I'll talk about in a minute, but you can also see here there's a definite line on the water where there's been a little bit of an overshot there. Now, things you can do is make this successful, you really have to spend a very long time masking. Accurate selections can help if you use selections. I generally don't. I just do it by hand, and I use a hard brush, and I get right in, sometimes to up to 400 or 500%, and then really just be extremely careful working around each spot to try not to create those halos. Obviously, I don't do that with exposure blending, but I do that when if I'm using a mask. The last thing you want is editing marks, because when you do print a large image, they show up quite significantly. There's a big difference between printing large and also and showing on Instagram, for example, where people are looking on their mobile phones and they can't see these issues. So I guess every image treated as if you're going to print it as a large print, and then you can be sure that it's finished and ready to go should you get a request for a print or decide to print one out yourself later. As I said at the beginning of the video, Florian also did some focus stacking, and he used it to focus stack in this particular rock here, in the foreground. Now I believe that this is the only focus stacking he did. The rest was just different exposures for exposure blending. And he said that each shot was taken at f8. Now, so this section was taken at f8 with obviously a blurred background, and then this section taken at f8 as well. I'll talk about down here, and you'll see where we have a bit of an issue with that focus stacking. And I guess, like exposure blending, if you're going to do it, you really have to be very careful how you do it, because otherwise you sort of lose what you're trying to achieve if you're not carefully making the edit. So I'll just zoom in. So here you can see that the foreground rock is beautifully in focus, and that's worked very well. Unfortunately, however, if you look here and look at this rock and look at the edges around here and through here, you can see the editing marks where the focus stacking hasn't been fully applied. So we end up with rocks that are, generally sharper, around here, but then here they're not. And then a very blurred edge here and very blurry in this section in here. And that's as a result of the masking that Florian's used. If you're going to use focus stacking, you really need to be extremely careful with the masking that you use. This will show up, if you did a large print of this will show up quite clearly, and that's one thing that you don't want to happen. The other focus stacking issue that we have is that he's taken the overall shot at f8 as well, and he hasn't focus stacked that. He's taken one sort of focused exposure. Now you can see here on this part of the rock, which is closer to the camera, it's quite sharp. But as we move along the rock further away from the camera, it gets more and more out of focus. And you can see here in the rocks and here that it's really quite soft. So the focusing at f8 for that background has actually come up a bit short, and it's not sharp at infinity. So I would certainly suggest focusing, probably either do more focus stacking, which again is a lot of trouble and a lot of effort, or choose a narrower aperture, such as f11 through to f16, just to get everything in focus, and being careful where your focus point is in the first place. It would be a good idea for people to have a look and get an understanding of what the hyperfocal point is. I'm not going to explain the hyperfocal point to you. There are a lot of tutorials and videos that should be able to explain that on the internet, so please look it up and understand what that is. I use the hyperfocal point, or my understanding of about where it is. I don't tend to look up hyperfocal charts when I'm shooting or anything like that, but with experience over time you learn where that hyperfocal point is for the apertures and focal lengths that you use, and you tend to focus, and I tend to focus on that point. So please look up the about hyperfocal distance, and you can learn a bit more about that from others that have put together some really nice tutorials. A couple of other things I'd like to just point out. It looks like there's and I realise this is starting to get towards the sun, but it almost looks like there's been a painting in of this brightness, and particularly here, that just looks a little bit overdone compared with the rest of the rocks here. It might just need a bit of feathering with the effect just to make it a little less more prominent, but it stands out like a line, like a stripe that's down the front there. Also this cloud up here, there's some banding in it. I think there's some issues with the colour. I'm not quite sure what's happening here now, being a sunrise and being away from the sun. This could well have been a purpley or magenta tone cloud, but it just appears that enhancing the colour there has just caused a little bit of banding, and it's probably a little bit too colourful for the image, and I'd just revisit maybe toning that colour down and seeing how you go with it. I've brought up the histogram just to show you what's going on with the scene. Now, there's not a lot happening in the light tones at all. Now, this is obviously a high contrast scene that's been managed using exposure blending, and I'd probably expect and want to see a bit more of a wider tonal range. It seems to be pushed more to the mid-tones and the lower mid-tones, and so I think a bit of work with contrast would be helpful. I'm not sure how to go about this with this particular blend. I'm not going to try and apply any contrast as I have in other critiques or anything like that. But I think just it needs a bit of a wider range in the tones, and you might be able to revisit that, Florian, with the exposures that you have, just to, even though it's got a wide range of tones that you've managed to blend in, it is a little flat in contrast, trying to get all that in together. So maybe give that a go. I guess in closing, I just want to reiterate a couple of things. With the advancement in technology, in software technology, in post-processing techniques and those sort of things, I think it's important for people that are just starting to learn landscape photography to take a step back from the technological and software side of it and focus more on natural light, where it's falling, and certainly focus on composition. I think learning composition should be the primary focus, and I'm sure Florian's doing lots of really great work in that, and he acknowledged himself that this he wasn't sure about this particular composition, but just because you can with post-processing, just because you've seen some advanced techniques on YouTube or similar, doesn't mean you necessarily should. I agree, if you're going to shoot this scene from this viewpoint at this time of day, then you're going to need to do some software post-processing work to capture the range of tones. But I would take a more simple and basic step back and look at a viewpoint that doesn't require so much work. It's something that you can revisit later once you get the full, you start to really develop your knowledge and skill. And getting those basics down is really important. There's a lot of influence out there now from very accomplished photographers who are also very accomplished post-processors, and their work's very visible on some of the more popular websites such as Instagram and 500px. And I'd say in most cases it's taken many years developing as a photographer first, and secondly developing as a post-processor to get those results. So I think just slow it down a little and get back to those basic skills, and this sort of thing will come in the future. And also there's certainly a lot of trend in landscape photography, and there's certainly a trend at the moment to produce a certain type of image that has a certain type of look. When you're starting out, you don't need to do that. You don't need to be necessarily following those trends. You just need to be capturing photographs and improving over time. And you do over time get to a point where you can try some more advanced techniques. There are some very skilled people out there, and a couple that spring to mind would be Dylan Toe from Everlook Photography. I've known Dylan for a long time, and he's been shooting landscapes for a long time, and he's developed over time his skill that allows him to really use exposure blending techniques very well. A friend of mine, Hilary Younger, has certainly advanced her post-processing techniques to a point that's on a par with some of the best that are out there. But again, she started at the same point everyone else did, and quite a few years ago, and she's developed that skill over a lot of time. So I guess my best advice is just to slow things down a bit and continue to visit these remarkable places that we have, and continue to shoot, and eventually you'll make mistakes, and you'll view lots of great images along the way, and you'll learn what works and what doesn't. So Florian, thank you very much for providing this image. I know I've talked about it a lot, and I've talked about it a lot more than some of the other images that I've critiqued, and thank you for being brave for sending it in. I really hope that you take the criticism that I've given to this photograph constructively, because that's certainly the way I've meant it, and I really hope that you've got some good things from it, and any other landscape photographers that are just starting to learn their craft also have learned a few things from it. Please, if you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments, and I'll address them as I can. Thanks very much, guys. Bye.